welcome to, I think it's the 12th, I've lost count. I think it's the 12th of our GeoTalks Express series. We started this way back in March, expecting to do it for a couple of months to, kind of give ourselves an opportunity to interact with customers during the pandemic, and we've continued, which is, it shows we have content to share. I'm joined for today's session by Jeff Hatzel. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning, David. How are you doing today?
You ready for some tips and tricks?
I am, yes.
I
ready
got
to
quite
go.
a few up my sleeve here today. Hopefully
Yeah.
you do this. You have the same.
Yes, I do.
Before we get rolling, we have a question come in right away, and we're going to talk about the logistics and housekeeping for those of you who haven't joined us. But we do have a question that's already come in, and I feel obliged to answer this question. Somebody has asked, was there a part one that was missed? Because we call this part two. Yes, there was a part one, but we realized after we wrote the abstract for this one that we called it something different. The first part was called So You Think You Know Global Mapper, but basically it was the same theme, tips and tricks. We're continuing with that theme today, and we're going to be talking, as we mentioned, about some of the kind of less well-known features and functions of Global Mapper, some of those hidden gems, as we've been calling them. I know that some of the folks that have joined us today are likely to be fairly experienced with Global Mapper. I'm going to guarantee that there'll be something today that you will not have been aware of. That's my personal objective, is to introduce all of you to something that you're not aware of, or maybe Jeff can do that as well. So before we begin, and we do have a lot on our list today, before we begin, couple of quick housekeeping issues. For those who haven't joined us before, I know there are those that are joining us for the first time. The webinar format, this is a listen-only setup. So in other words, you can hear us, we hope, but we can't hear you. If you do want to ask questions, there is a questions panel on the side, on the right side of your screen that should have popped up automatically when you logged into the meeting. Check out that questions panel. At least one person has already found it. Go ahead and ask your questions in there. And we do request that you try to make those relevant to what we're covering today. I know you may have a lot of questions about other features or functions in our software. We'll show you at the end how you can contact us directly with those questions, but trying to keep those questions relevant. Some of those we will try to answer verbally so that everyone can hear the response, hear the question and the response. We will also accumulate or collect those questions at the end and answer you directly. You'll get an email from us with a response. And we'll also put those responses in a blog that will link at the bottom of the recording. Speaking of which, this is being recorded. I always have to check, and it is. This is being recorded, which means if you want to see something again, you can check it out on our YouTube channel, or obviously if you're watching a recording of this, and you can obviously rewind as needed if you want some clarification. So what are we doing in the next few sessions? We've got I think up until November scheduled. You can check it on our website. Next one is going to be an interesting one, an introduction to scripting. A lot of folks that I talk to about scripting are a little intimidated by the idea of getting into this kind of interacting with Global Mapper through a script. Please don't be. As you'll see in this session in a couple of weeks, scripting is fairly straightforward. The idea of defining your process through a text file, basically, rather than interacting with the interface, gives you a lot of different options when it comes to some of the workflows that you would go through. So we're going to do a scripting session on September 2nd, middle of the month. We have recently, I think within this week, last week, announced our training schedule for the rest of the calendar year. We've got a couple of public training classes. Those are open for registration. And on our September 16th session, we'll give you a little preview of what that training involves, so you can see, if this is something that will be beneficial to you to kind of help you get the most out of the software. Moving towards the end of the month, okay, we've got 3 in September. That's September 30th. This is a big one for a lot of folks. Our annual What's New. We release a whole number version of Global Mapper, usually in September, so around about that time frame. And coinciding with that, we will have an hour-long session that focuses on the latest features and functions that have been added. I anticipate this one will be a very popular one. So please, as noted on the link below here, go to bluemarblegeo.com/geotalksexpress for information, for links to all of these, for these and additional webinars that we'll be hosting, and sign up today so you can guarantee your slot. So for today, and I had to actually reduce the font size here so I could fit in everything we're hoping to do. We're going to go back and forth. Jeff and I are going to switch back like we've done in previous sessions, kind of demonstrating some of these tools. We're going to begin, Jeff's going to begin talking a little bit about how we interface with Google Earth. Very interesting little application. Maybe you haven't seen this one. This might be a new one for some of you. We'll talk a little bit about terrain. We're going to do some visualization and extraction of terrain, specifically with some slope data. We'll also generate a mesh from terrain, bringing in a terrain layer and generating a vector mesh from that data. InfoTips. Jeff's a big fan of InfoTips. I happen to know that because I was doing a training class with Jeff a couple of weeks ago, and Jeff had InfoTips enabled. I said, Jeff, maybe we should talk about that during our webinar, and you can do the talking. So Jeff's going to tell us all about InfoTips and what InfoTips is, and it's a very useful tool within the application. Those of you who did attend round 1 of our So You Think You Know Global Mapper back in, I think, March or April, we did an exercise on 3D thematic mapping where we extruded some polygons to reflect an attribute. If you're intrigued by what I've just said, go back and look at the video of that one and you'll see how that one works. We're going to take a slightly different approach this time around to do a 3D representation of a point to reflect an attribute. So yeah, another 3D thematic mapping exercise, almost a tongue twister. Jeff's going to talk about some raster cropping, specifically cropping the color of a map, a topographic map. I don't spoil the plot for now, but Jeff can show us that one. And I think also with that data, we'll talk a little bit about some of the transparency options you have when working with raster data. This has actually changed a little bit within the last couple of releases. So Jeff's going to show us how we can assign a color or colors to be transparent in a raster layer. We'll get back into looking at some terrain again and do a little exercise in feathering. In our last session, again, earlier in the year, we did an exercise in image feathering, blending or kind of transitioning between two images. We'll do the same with elevation. Same basic process, but with a slightly different end result. We'll get into looking at some contours. Jeff's going to take us to the Grand Canyon, I believe, on a trip out west from where we are. And rather than just creating simple line polygons, we're going to create some line contours. We're going to create some polygon contours, kind of different way of generating those contour lines, and an interesting visualization when you see that in the 3D view. This is a function that we sometimes talk about in our training classes, and I get a lot of questions about this, a lot of follow-up. So we decided we would add this one here, adding a hyperlink to a feature. There's multiple different applications for this, being able to embed a file in the map that's accessible by clicking, and we'll show you how that works on one very specific workflow related to this. And as a follow-up, this is something that you will not find documented anywhere, but we'll also talk about customizing the default data. I'm going to relate these two workflows together because what I do with the first workflow, I'll actually customize the default data with what I create in this first workflow. And time permitting, and this is going to bring us hopefully towards the top of the hour, Jeff's going to talk about generating a PDF, but specifically a 3D PDF. If you haven't seen this, haven't looked at this with any of your 3D data, it is a really, really cool way of being able to take that data and maybe share it with a client. So there's a lot to do here. Somebody's already asking about the recording. Yes, this recording is going to be available hopefully within a couple of days. Check out, you'll get an email with that information. We can also check out our YouTube channel as well for that. Jeff, are you ready? Do you have your seatbelt strapped? We got a long journey ahead of us here.
Ready to go.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to hand over the screen here.
Okay.
If I can find the right button. And Jeff, you should be good to go. Telling us about a little bit about how we can work with Google Earth.
Okay, so some of you may be familiar with just the basic, when working with Google Earth, our data in Google Earth is very often in KML or KMZ format. And Global Mapper handles the export to that no problem. Sometimes though, we don't necessarily need to directly export to a KML or KMZ file, but we want to quickly see where we are working in Global Mapper, but in Google Earth. So that's what we're going to look at today. What I have loaded here is just some basic tax parcel data sets. First thing we're going to do, I'd like to change the color of this just so that it stands out a little more. Double clicking on any layer gets us right into the layer options. And under the area styles, I'm just going to customize it And let's go ahead and make that red, just so it stands out a little better as we're working today. Now we'll see that with this data, if I use my feature info tool, each of these features has a large amount of attribute information associated with it. And the great thing about the functionality we're going to look at shortly is that all of this is going to be retained in my view. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to select my data set. The reason that I'm selecting it is because I want to see it in Google Earth. You don't have to do this, but I do want to include the data. So the functionality we're going to look at is in the Zoom menu. And if we go down to the option of Zoom View, we have the very bottom choice here to zoom to view in Google Earth. Now this assumes that you have Google Earth Pro installed on your computer so that you can access it directly, and that's essentially what Global Mapper does. It calls Google Earth to launch it. I'm asked then if I want to include the data that I have selected. In this case, I do, so I'll choose yes. Now, when that happens, we'll see Google Earth load and render, and that may take a second here. But we'll see now that Google Earth is not only zooming to the location where I was working, but it is also showing me the tax parcels that I had selected and displayed in Global Mapper. Now, I can click on any of these parcels and I'll see all of the attribute information that was associated with them in Global Mapper 2. Regardless of what feature I click on, all of that information has been retained. One of the really nice features of this functionality is that I can now use Google Earth Street View. And if I go into Street View, I get the standard Street View visual, but Google Earth also displays my vector data. Now they displayed a little above ground, just so we can see it off in the distance, but I can see that data set on my map as I navigate and move around within Google Earth. And so one of the most common reasons that I use this functionality in Global Mapper is when I'm working in an area that I don't know. I may not have any sort of reference map data or base map imagery or anything like that. And so if I'm back in Global Mapper and just looking at a data set like this and I don't really know where it is, it's a great way to quickly pop open Google Earth, get a feel, and navigate around a little bit.
And Jeff, we just had a question came in. I think it was just slightly before you started, because you answered the question. Somebody asked if they can export shape data, a shapefile, to a KML file, complete with text display and full attributes. And while what Jeff did was an automatic version of that, you can also manually export KML.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, if you need to really control your KML export, do it from the export menu. You can choose from our many export options. Whether you're exporting a raster or vector KML, you can choose all the settings for that. So that would be more appropriate for that type of workflow.
Yeah, and another follow-up question from what you just did: can you bring the Google Earth image into Global Mapper? Well, there's no direct connection that way. Jeff, if you want to quickly show the online data dialog box, we're not going to go any deeper into this. This is something we have talked about in the past, but this online data function gives you access to a number of different data sets, imagery, etc. And if you, there are pre-built services you can access imagery. There's a world imagery data set, but you can also add your own in here. So yeah, there are opportunities to add multiple base map data sets right into Global Mapper. So. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to steal a screen back, Jeff.
Sure.
I'm going to change our focus slightly here, and we're going to take a look at some terrain. Now, this is something you may have seen before. I know we've done a lot of terrain-focused presentations. In fact, the last one we did a couple of weeks ago was very specifically working with terrain in Global Mapper. If you missed that one, again, that recording is available on our YouTube channel. Specifically today, I'm going to talk about one very specific visualization that can be applied. Now we're looking at our shader here. This is just an area of some terrain. The default visualization, as noted by my shader here, is what we refer to as our Atlas shader. From the drop down, there's a number of different options, including the option to create a custom shader, which is something we did last week. But I want to draw your attention specifically to the slope shader. Now, slope shader changes the representation of terrain. So we're no longer looking at specific elevations, but rather what we're looking at is a visual representation of the relationship of a pixel to its neighbors in terms of the offset, an angle basically. And you can see that angle in my legend now. This is no longer reflecting a above sea level meter or feet value, but this is actually degrees. So the darker the areas, the steeper the slopes. Now in this example, this is actually happens to be some sand dunes in coastal Brazil. And in this example, you can see the dark colors are fairly dark. This might be an example where I want to spread out the colors a little bit to extend this range. So I'm going to do that first. This is a configuration option, and it will show you that there are some choices you can make when it comes to how you display your shaders. Specifically, what I'm looking at is my slope shader. I can define what those values are, and I also can define the colors. Right now, they're set to black and white, as you can see. I'm going to leave the colors as they are, but I'm going to extend the maximum slope, which is currently set to 25 degrees. And because I know the slopes here are relatively steep, I'm trying to drag my dialog box out of the way. It will not let me. I'm going to extend this to, I'm going to make it 40. So that will extend the legend and extend the range of colors here. It will interpolate a little bit better, I guess is what I'm saying. We'll click OK. And you can see now I have a much more gradual transition. I can see these steeper slopes a little more clearly. Now, what we're going to do with these slopes is we're going to actually generate vector polygons representing slopes of a specific range. This is a tool that we've looked at in a few different contexts. Specifically, I'm looking at my terrain data here. It's a GMG, which is a global mapper grid file. I'm going to right-click all the way to the bottom, going to Layer, and we have this option to create area features. Now, this can be done with imagery. In our last tips and tricks, which we called So You Think You Know Global Mapper, Billy, our colleague, did this with some imagery, and he actually extracted some vector polygons from RGB values. Here, because we have a slope representation of terrain, what I'm extracting are slope values, just confirming the layer I'm going to apply this to. And the only setting I really need to apply here is what we call fuzziness. This is a threshold value that will extend the range of each polygon. And you can try this, try a little trial and error as to what works. I'm going to set this as 3. This will give me kind of a range of slope values within each polygon. I'm just going to limit this to the extent of my screen as well, just in the interest of time. And we'll click OK. And hopefully, within a few seconds here, you can see we now have vector polygons. I'll turn off the original terrain layer just to avoid confusion here, just to verify that we're now looking at a vector layer. This vector layer contains, as you can see, polygons with the same colors assigned that I saw in the original layer. And I'm not going to go any further with this. We've all worked with vector data. We know what tools are available. I could query, I can filter, I can export to shape, I can export to KML, I can export to whatever format I want. But the fact is we have migrated data from a raster format into vectors that becomes a lot more interactive. So again, extracting elevation values, specifically slope values in this case. And I should also mention that if the shader that I had previously selected was something other than slope, I would have been prompted to extract vector polygons representing elevations as opposed to slopes. The availability of that slopes option is only triggered by the fact that this shader was selected.
David, while you're discussing shaders, we had a question come in asking about how to import or export shaders, so I thought you might want to show the new settings we have for that.
Sure. There is an option here to create a custom shader if you want to start from scratch, if you're feeling very artistic. Within the configuration dialog box under our shader options where we were before, you'll see the option here to, again, create custom shaders or to edit shaders. Jeff, have you ever imported a shader? Have you gone through that process?
I have before in the setting I was thinking of actually, so that works as well. I was thinking of the new option under the help menu to import and export user settings.
Correct. I see what you mean.
Also includes all your shaders.
Correct. Yeah. If someone else in your organization has taken the initiative and spent a few days developing custom shaders, yeah, you can import. I'll show you that in a second. But while we're here, this is where you would begin the process from scratch. Actually, I've been playing around with a shader here with just some simple colors, but you can see we can initialize these from external files. if that's something you need to do. What Jeff was talking about, I'll just cancel. What Jeff was talking about from the help menu is importing and exporting user settings. So if someone else has created those custom shaders, as well as other settings within the application, you can absolutely do this. Okay, I'm going to continue here with another workflow. Let me turn off my vectors, and I'll turn back on my terrain data, as well as some imagery. This is some just kind of visual context, seeing where we are. The next bullet on my list, my PowerPoint list, was creating a mesh from a terrain layer. Now, a mesh is a vector file format. We have used these in a lot of contexts, specifically in our pixels to points tool for processing drone imagery, overlapping drone imagery. One of the output products from that is a mesh or a 3D model. If you want to see that, again, we have done a previous presentation and we generate that. What I am going to do now is create a mesh from a terrain layer. And this is a little bit hidden. It's a right-click option on the terrain layer. I'm going to go all the way to the bottom, and right here, create mesh from features from terrain. I'm going to actually incorporate the imagery as well to give me a visual representation. We'll click OK. And the only thing I'm going to change here is the extent. Again, we'll limit it to what's on my screen. We'll click OK. Shouldn't take too long. I've done already. We will turn off the original terrain. Now, what's left looks the same, actually. Make sure I turn off the imagery too. What left looks the same, but this is a vector file. This is a 3D model. Now, the way to prove that is to bring up my 3D viewer, and we can now see that as a 3D model. Now, this was a DTM. Obviously, we don't have buildings represented here, but the most common or most logical way to use this function is with a DSM, where you include all of those above ground features as well. So you literally end up, and I know the streamed version of this transition is a little bit laggy because of our bandwidth, but yeah, this will give you a representation of all of the features, whether it be terrain or buildings or etc., if you use the DSM approach. So interesting visualization. Jeff, I know you've been chomping at the bit for this one. InfoTips. Let's go ahead and hand it back to Jeff again.
Okay, so InfoTips are something David hinted at that I am fond of because I think they make our workflows a lot more efficient and give us an easy way to see information. What an InfoTip does is wherever my cursor were to come sit on my map, if it was over data, it would pop up a little bit of information about whatever is under my cursor. I don't have any enabled now, but let's go ahead and take a look at how we can set them up and what they can do for us. So under the View menu, we have two options here. First would be to enable InfoTips. More importantly, would be to configure them first, because I want to tell the application what I want to show with my certain InfoTips. So when I choose to configure them, the very first thing I'll make sure to do is to enable them so they are on after I set my settings. If I wanted, I could include my cursor location. So my X and Y value would pop up at the location of my cursor. One option that I always like to have on is the option to include the layer name so that I can see the name of the layer that I'm working on or that I'm seeing information for. So right now we're working with some vector data, so we won't look at raster data just yet. But for vector data, I can show either just the basic feature label, which if there's a feature label associated with each feature, that would pop up. If not, I can show a custom attribute string, and that's what we're going to take a look at here. So I've set up this string. It looks a bit complicated, but really it's fairly straightforward. Each block of text between the percent symbols is just the name of an attribute from a given layer. So I have an attribute called building number. I have an attribute called street name. This one would be street type. And then on a new line, I have my estimated market value. And before that, I'm just adding a $sign so that I can see a $sign represented before that dollar value. If you wanted to get into styling those InfoTips, you could certainly choose how you would like them styled. I generally just tend to leave it as normal text. Now when I hit OK, and let's go ahead and I'll place my cursor over an object, I'll see that I now have a little pop-up at my cursor. The first line shows me my layer name. The second line shows me my building number, my street name, and my street type, just as I had defined. And then the very bottom line here shows me my market value for that plot with the preceding $sign that I had added. So these are dynamic. They'll show up for any object that has that information associated with it. So as you cursor around your map, a great way in this case for me to see both my address and the value or the last known value of that property. I find InfoTips even more useful when we're working with terrain data. And so what I have loaded here is two different terrain data sets. I have a flattened terrain model, so that's what we're seeing on top. And below that, I have a non-flattened surface model. And now when I say flattened, what I mean is that I used a 3D vector feature to flatten the terrain of this surface when I created this surface. So that's what I mean when I say that. Why I like to use InfoTips with this type of data is because I have two data sets overlapping and I might want to see information about both of them at once. So I need to set up my InfoTips again because last time all I did was set some vector options. Now I can leave those on or turn those off. It doesn't matter since I don't have any vector data loaded. But what I am concerned with is what to show for my grid data. In this case, I want to see elevation value, so whatever the elevation is at my cursor. And since I have multiple terrain layers loaded that overlap, I'm going to choose the option to include values from all of the layers under my cursor. This is another great opportunity to keep the layer name enabled so that I can see which layer is associated with which elevation value. And now we'll see at my cursor, I get two heights reported. One labeled as my flattened layer, the other labeled as my not flattened layer. This will hold true no matter where my cursor rests on my map and allows me a great way to see the specific elevation at a given location. The very last thing I'll show with this, so David talked a little bit about our shaders, and I'm just using the default Atlas shader now. But there might be an instance where you want different layers displayed with different shaders. So what I'm going to do, instead of changing my global shader, which would change both layers loaded, I'm going to go into my layer options for, in this case, we'll just use the flattened layer, it doesn't matter. And I'm going to override the default shader and instead choose to use the same slope shader that David had up earlier. Now, when I apply this, we'll see my shader for my flattened layer has changed. The not flattened layer underneath it, still using the global shader. And when I use InfoTips here now, we'll see that I also get a slope reported for the layer that is displayed by slope. So I can see both my slope percentage as well as my slope represented in degrees. So again, just a really efficient way to get a quick glimpse of data at a given location.
Yeah, Jeff, you triggered quite a few questions here. It must have sparked some interest. An interesting question: what happens if there's no attribute in any particular field? If an attribute is blank or null? I'll just go ahead. I'm going to assume that that would just be blank and the info tip would not appear.
Yep. David, your mic sounds a little quiet. I'm not sure if everyone's getting that, but
try it a little bit better.
Much better, yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, well, let me repeat the question. Somebody asked if the attribute was null or blank. Thank you, Jeff. It would just be blank in the info tip. You would not see anything there. Will InfoTips work with Google Earth? I think if you go into Google Earth, that's a whole different environment. So obviously InfoTips is specific to Global Mapper. There's likely something comparable in Google Earth that you can enable. And question, I think you answered this one in the second part of your workflow. Will it work on two DEM files? Well, essentially that's what Jeff did here. He had two terrain layers. The other thing to note is if Jeff with the InfoTips configured as they are now, if Jeff loads his vector layer again, nothing will display. It's literally looking for the specific characteristics that are assigned, and if you don't have any terrain data, it just won't display anything. The box won't come up at all. And similarly, if he kept his vector string but used his terrain data, again, nothing would be displayed. So, Jeff, I don't know if you have any appropriate data to demonstrate this. Someone has asked about creating a tin. Does Global Mapper have the function to create a tin? Again, this is not really relevant to what we're doing, but it's an easy answer. The answer is yes. If you're generating a surface from, for instance, LiDAR data, one of the options you have is to save a tin. It actually generates a tin under the hood anyway, but you can save that as a vector file as an option when you generate a raster surface. So answer to that question is
we can take a look at that quick here, David. I do have data paired with this data set.
Okay.
If we want to show that, just taking a second to load. But yeah, so these two terrain layers did not happen to be created with the tin method. With the LiDAR module, we have a few other options as to how we want to create our data set. But so when we go to create an elevation grid, we have a grid method. You would choose to make the tin, or use the tin method, I should say. And then once you choose that, you also have the option to save a vector tin of that region as well. So yes, that function.
Yeah, sorry, which is not on by default. So yeah.
Correct.
Okay. You notice your current window order. Okay, Jeff, could you explain a little bit about the order of the layers in the control center and the fact that you can invert them? I think somebody has seen something a little different from their setup.
Yeah, that's probably another good little tip and trick.
Little tip and trick, bonus tip and trick.
Yes, so I prefer to show my layer list where whatever is on top of my list is visually on top of my data set. That is enabled by right-clicking on your workspace in the control center and choosing the option to display your layer list in reverse order. This just allows such that a little bit more easy for me to understand, where if I have whatever data is on top here, or conversely on the bottom, I know that's how it corresponds in my visual as well.
Okay. So we're answering questions that are not even related to our thing. Let's get back on task here. I'm going to grab the screen again, Jeff, here.
Sure.
So one of the bullets I mentioned during the introduction was 3D thematic mapping. We're looking at a map of California here with some dots. These dots represent weather stations. And if I click on one of the dots, I have got information about temperature, max, min, average, and precipitation. The precipitation specifically is what I'm interested in visualizing. And I want to visualize it in 3D. Now, if we were actually doing this, we could actually generate a different scale symbol in the 2D view as well. I'm not going to worry about that for now. But I want to look at that in 3D. You know, just by default, if I pop up my 3D view now, the rendering of those points, I configured this. I need to revert back to what I did before. I have the completed version of the workflow. If I hadn't completed the workflow, those dots would have appeared as simple flattened models, flattened points. So you wouldn't have any visual representation. What I'm going to do, and what I actually have already done, but I'll show you how I did it, is to assign a 3D symbol to each of these points, so that when we pop it up in 3D, it actually appears as a 3D model. And there's multiple options. Let me do that first. And this is something you can do with any point data. This is a configuration option again. We're spending a lot of time in the configuration dialog box. Specifically under styles and under point styles, there is a list of all the point styles in here. I added one called rainfall. I probably should have called it precipitation to be more technically appropriate, but I called it rainfall. I created this myself, and this is what I forgot to revert back to the default. I assigned a 3D model, as you can see. And there are a number of different options in here. Some are very specific, and you can play around with these yourself. Again, these will be what will be assigned to a specific point style when you look at it in 3D. And the example that I chose was the blue sphere, or sphere blue. You can have a red sphere as well. Everything else here should be fine. This is just associating a 3D model with a particular type of point. We'll click OK. And that is what is displayed here, by the way. The feature type is rainfall, as you can see. That is the point style that I've used. The next step that's required for that visualization is to assign a scale for each of those 3D points. And this is applied as an option in that layer. For the 335 points in that layer, I'm going to ask Global Mapper, by looking at elevations, and this is what I forgot to revert again, that the model height will be derived from an attribute. So I'm basically scaling the size of the model derived from what value was in this attribute. And we previewed that. That was several thousand. I think that's millimeters of rainfall. I'm going to pretend that those are actually meters. So the points that will appear in 3D will be scaled to whatever that meter, 1,000 meters, a kilometer wide dot on the map. You may have actually noticed this in the intro, one of the intro slides where I showed a screenshot of that. Okay, everything is done. I didn't actually have to change anything. Once again, well, this time we'll pop up 3D and we'll actually zoom in a little closer here. And you can see now that these point features are being represented by a blue sphere. And the size of that sphere represents the amount of rainfall. It's a reflection on that attribute value. And you can be very creative with this now that you know this is available. This scalable vector visualization in 3D can be used as a very interesting way to look at an attribute in a visual context. And if you want to see this in the context of polygons, again, go back to our first tips and tricks back in March, and you'll see an example where we used extruded polygons to visualize this 3D data. So quick little demonstration. Unfortunately, I'd forgotten to revert, so it was already done for you, but hopefully you got the steps involved and how that process works. Moving quick and fast here, I'm going to transfer back over to Jeff. Jeff, are you ready to show us some cropping options?
I am, yes. So Global Mapper has a variety of different ways we can crop data. In this case, what's important to us is we are looking at some maps that have boundary information with them. So these are, USGS quad maps. I'm sure many of us are familiar with, at least in the States. Your country, if you're out of the US, may make similar ones. But we don't necessarily need all of this border information with it. So let me just go ahead. We'll take a look. Let's just look at one to zoom in here. So each of these maps has a variety of metadata information across the bottom of it, along with things like your grid information on the edges and some title and heading information across the top. Now, while that may have been useful at some stage, for us now looking at this in a geographic space, I don't want this information on my map because it's interfering with how I view my data sets. The layer options within Global Mapper for raster data lets us get into cropping. Now you'll see my data here is listed in a group. So my group layer is called USGS quads, and then I have all the individual files associated with that listed in here. Anytime data is grouped, we can access options for all the layers just by double-clicking right on the group. So whatever I do here is now going to apply to all the data in that group, which is really handy. In this case, we're working with, 9 or 10 files. Under the cropping tab, so we have a whole different set of options for manually cropping or cutting out to certain areas, all things that may be useful in a different workflow. For us today, we want to take a look at automatically cropping the collar. So what this does for certain file formats and certain types of data that have a collar defined in them as the bounds of the map data, this is most often in the file's metadata, Global Mapper can recognize that and automatically crop to it. We happen to be working with TIFF files today. Most common, I would say, we probably see this with GeoPDFs. So, for those of you, at least I know off the top of my head, in the US, Canada, Mexico, all those GeoPDFs are already supported, and I know there's some support for those in other countries as well. And really, as long as that collar is defined in the file, Global Mapper should be able to crop it with no problem. So let's go ahead and we'll apply that crop here. When I do that, we'll see we no longer have any of the data outside of the neat line of the map. So I'm just looking at my map data. I suppose it's important to note that cropping is not permanent until you export the data, so I can always undo my cropping if I want to. But in this case, I want my cropping on. we can zoom in now to a boundary, and we see our data is smooth. We don't have any of that map bounding information here. I just continue right from one quad to the other with all my data visible on screen now. If this was something you wanted to make permanent to the file, you would export it right out of the application. Let's take a look.
Sorry, Jeff, that export would
Yeah,
be one large file. That is the default. It would not retain each individual file. If you ran a standard export now, you would get one merged version or mosaiced version of all of these individual maps.
Yep, absolutely. And so let's go ahead. We're going to take a look, continue looking at some of these quads. Well, actually, we're just going to take a look at one because I have that quad paired with some imagery data. And this imagery data happens to be actually near our headquarters. What we are concerned with here, though, is I want to pair this imagery with one of my quad maps. But I don't necessarily need to see all of the data within this map because I want to see some of the imagery through it. So for a while, Global Mapper has had some transparency options, but we've updated and improved those recently. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at making one of these layers, applying some transparency to it. Opening my layer options, the default tab is the display tab, and this is where our transparency options reside. So the first thing I would do is remember to make sure to enable transparency because I want to set some things to transparent. And now I can choose what specific colors I'm going to use to make transparent. Now in this case, this is a palette image, so I can very easily choose from a variety of the palette index values. If I wanted to, I could also manually pick from the map. That would activate a little color dropper. In this case, I don't actually want to do that, so we'll cancel that. Instead, what we're going to do is manually choose palette index 2. That's just white for our background, and we'll go ahead holding down the control key. I can click a second option or as many options as I want. In this case, we're just going to click 2 and 6, and I'm going to make those transparent. If we were working with more of a traditional RGB map, and this would work here, I could adjust my slider here. What this will do is look for a little bit of a buffer around the given colors I define, so not quite that precise green and not quite that precise white. But in this case, since it's a palette image, we're just going to look for those 2 specific colors. And now when I apply that, we'll see that those colors are no longer displayed in my image. I'll zoom into my image data here. We'll still be able to see all of our roads, our labels and contours, and all the other information that was associated with this original file because I didn't make those colors transparent. But now I can have that displayed what looks like right over all of my base imagery that I wanted to have visible in the first place. So a great way to manipulate some of the transparency options with your data. Again, not something that's permanent. I could turn off my transparency and get back to my regular map if that was desired.
Okay, we have a bunch of questions coming. I think there's a little bit of time lag on the questions because some of the questions pertain to things that we had done earlier. Jeff, while I'm transitioning back to my own screen here, I'm going to try to multitask and ask and answer questions at the same time.
Okay.
One, how do you get the different binning options? Maybe you could just talk to that very quickly. Somebody had noticed there's binning as well as tinning when you generate a surface.
Oh, yep. So binning is only available with the LiDAR module, and the most recent versions of Global Mapper version 21.1 have a couple new binning methods as well. So that could be a mix of you don't have the LiDAR module or you don't have the latest version of version 21.1 that has some new binning options in there.
Yeah, the dialog, I don't have the appropriate data, but the dialog box that Jeff showed us for generating a tin is where you can make that selection. And I think they're listed even if you don't have the LiDAR module, but you'll see that they're not actually technically available. Second question, I'll just go ahead and grab this one. It's related to that. How do you burn a DEM if you want to change the depth of a river? Hydro flattening, which can be done by the polygon or a line, is available also in the LiDAR module. If you have a polygon with an elevation value or a line with per vertex elevations, you do have the option then to use that for hydroflattening, for burning, in basically overriding the default terrain. So yeah, those two options are available. Speaking of terrain, let's take a look at another kind of interesting little workflow. If you notice here, I've got two terrain layers. I've got some underlying fairly low resolution elevation data. This is 10 meter, the USGS national elevation data set. We use that a lot for some of our simulations. Superimposed on top here, we have a small area of some LiDAR derived elevation, much higher resolution, as you will see. The challenge here is in addressing the transition between the two. Now, before I get into that workflow, this may be related to another question that has come up in regards to creating an average. Somebody asked about averaging terrain layers. There's a whole section of our terrain analysis function that deals with these multiple layers and what we can do with them. It's called combine compare terrain layers. You'll see this in the toolbar. I'm not going to actually do any of this, go through these processes right now, but I just want to make sure you're aware that when you have multiple terrain layers, you can do things like average them or find the greater of the two, minimum, maximum, or multiply them if that's relevant. So you'd have multiple options here. We've actually used this in the context of visualizing difference between surface layers. I think Katrina in our last exercise did an exercise with Mount St. Helens where she visualized the difference in two time frames. This is how you would do that as well. So I just want to draw your attention to this tool if you're not aware of it. Specifically, what I want to address is the idea that we have multiple resolutions, and as a consequence, if I pop up my 3D view, probably a little easier to see here, we have a very distinct and abrupt transition. I'm not sure if you're seeing this clearly. Maybe if I pop up my exaggeration just a little bit here. Between these two surfaces, it looks like a fairly abrupt drop-off here. Now, that not only has that an effect visually, but also functionally. If you're performing any analysis, watershed analysis, or anything like that, you're obviously going to encounter this cliff, which doesn't really exist, and this is simply a consequence of the resolution. So what I want to do is to initiate a feathering process that feathers these together. Actually, before I do that, one more way of visualizing this, probably the most effective, is to generate a quick profile. And you can see very clearly here, there's my drop off. I did it for a very short range here, but very clear we have about a 2 meter drop if you're walking along. This, believe me, this does not exist in the real world. To address this issue, we're going to feather these two surface layers together. Similar to what we did in our previous session where we feathered imagery, we are going to feather our LiDAR elevation data. Double click to bring up the options for that layer. Feathering is a tab here, and we're going to feather around all 4 edges. The feathering distance, basically the distance into the image that will be feathered, is a multiple of the pixel size. Now, I didn't check out the metadata first, but I believe the pixel size here is about 1 meter in the high resolution data. So if I type in 100 here, that would be 100 meters into the image that would be feathered. Basically, it would interpolate in a gradient the transition in elevation values. We'll leave that as is. We'll click apply. And immediately you will see that visual change where the elevation values have now been interpolated. I could obviously pop up the 3D map to see that as well, but again, the most effective way is likely to generate a profile. If I run that profile again, you will now see, I think I must have some offset data here. I'm not quite sure why it's showing me that full extent. Try that one more time. Have I clamped my elevation data? I have not. I'm not quite sure why it's flattening to the level that it is.
I think you have your scales matched, X and Y.
I think I do. Let's see, right click. Oh, I do. I know I do. Hang on just one second. Right here. Thank you, Jeff. I'm glad somebody's paying attention. So this would be a lot. We do get this question a lot. Is there an option to make the vertical and horizontal scales the same? Yes, there is the answer to the question that was not asked. There we go. That's a little bit more friendly. As you can see now, we have a more gradual transition where previously it was a steep drop off. You can see right where my cursor is right now where we initiated that feathering. Makes it a lot more pleasing to the eye, but also functionally it works a lot better as well. Continuing on the theme of elevation, hopefully with the settings not messing up your workflow, Jeff, I'm going to hand back to you. I'm going to take us to a very interesting part of the world.
Okay.
Take a trip to the Grand Canyon, I believe.
Sure. Yes, we are. So what we are looking at here is a terrain model of the Grand Canyon. You might notice, those of you who are watching, my file format for the layer happens to say GMG, If we haven't ever discussed that before, GMG is a global mapper grid. It's just a format we make for within global mapper that allows you to really efficiently work with terrain data. So something worth checking into if you ever work with large amount of terrain data. That being said, we are going to talk about some different ways to make and stylize contours. The reason being is that we want to have an understanding of elevation change across this area, but with vector data. So we'll just take a quick look at this data set in 3D, more so because I think it's a great data set to look at. But we have a nice high-res representation here of the Grand Canyon. We're going to use this data set now to build some contours based off of this terrain. So within my contour generation tool, I just need to apply a few settings to make sure that I'm building these contours properly. I will give the layer that's getting created a new name. We'll call it 100-meter contours. I'm going to make them every 100 meters in this case. Important to note here, what I'm going to do is also choose an option to generate area features. These will, in addition to making contour lines, also make an area representing each contour's elevation, which we'll see in a second. They'll be colored based off of the shader that I have currently displayed, which is just the Atlas shader by default. So when these layers get created, or these features get created, I should say, we will have both area features and line features for the same region. And that may be visually a little much. So when they are finished, we're going to look at a layer management option that I really like that allows us to split vector features based on certain attributes. And so what that's going to allow me to do is to easily separate out both my area and line feature contours from one layer into their own individual layers once this process completes here, which is taking a little longer than usual, but here we go. So if I turn off my terrain data set, we see I have a lot of information displayed on my screen now. I have both area and line contours and labels. The very first thing we're going to do, actually, I think I'll shut off my labels. So right in layer options, I can uncheck the option to display my labels. That makes things a little bit more manageable already. Then I'm going to choose the option by right-clicking on my layer and going, where's my split option here? There we go, towards the bottom of the layer submenu to split my layers based on a certain attribute. Now you could do this for any attribute type of any vector data set. In this case, we're going to just leave it as the feature description because the description gives me the ability to split how I would like. I have a new layer group now that has my area contours as well as my intermediate, major, and minor contour lines. Very first thing we'll take a look at is just our contour areas. So these are area features. If I were to use my feature info tool on one, we could see in this case just the elevation attribute, but it does have attribute information associated with that feature. I could select that feature as well, given that it is just a traditional vector area feature. Taking a look at these in 3D is really where we get to see the power of this visual. So each of these features that we're seeing is now an area feature representing a given elevation. So I can very clearly see areas where I have a change in elevation and how they're represented, in this case with the area features shaded or colored from the associated shader. This gives us a great way, if we were working on making a fly-through in 3D view, fortunately we won't have a chance to look at that today, but flying through our data, a great way to visualize and work with these contours. Another nice feature of this is that now that I have an area representing a given elevation, I could also select and search within given areas too. So I now have a whole bunch of new functionality simply by making my contours as area features. That being said, there's still a couple things, but at least one thing that I would like to show with our contour lines. So by default, our contour styling is just styled in a brown color with different thickness indicating my major, intermediate, and minor contours. What I would like to do here is to color these based on a shader. So if I go into my layer options, I'm going to choose my line styles. Instead of using the default, I'm going to specify a style. It's a bit of the ways down my style list, but it's called elevation. And I'm going to do so as a solid line. When I apply this, we'll see that not only do those line features get colored based on the shader color for that elevation, these features are also fully three-dimensional line features. And I almost happen to think, I don't know, this makes a great visual in 3D. Let me increase my exaggeration here a little. But I can now very clearly see all of those contour lines are three-dimensional. I have the great color styling from the shader that allows me to get even more of a detailed perspective of that data set.
Couple of questions here, Jeff, while you're doing
Sure.
that's visually really cool. We've done over the last couple of weeks, I've actually introduced a few different ways of visualizing terrain. Our profile, perpendicular profiles, created a very interesting vector version of terrain as well. Someone asked, can you produce volume between two of the contours? The answer to that is yes. I don't know, Jeff, I don't think we should take the time to do it, but there are ways to calculate volume between surfaces. I'm not even, Jeff, this will be a little bit too much, and we're quickly running out of time. If you look at the previous webinar, basically you can define volume between two surfaces or based on a vector line. You basically draw a vector polygon, I'm sorry. So you draw that vector polygon, and you can then calculate volumes between the two. So the answer to that is definitely yes, you can calculate volumes. Someone asked about the workflow I just did with feathering elevation. Will it be exported as a feathered layer? Yes. What you see is what you get when it comes to exporting. So if you do some cleanup of your terrain data, run an export to whatever format is applicable, the DEM format, it will export the feathered version of your two layers. I think that's it for now. Oh, somebody had mentioned that some of the binning options were not available in the release build of 21.1. Jeff, I think those were added after release, so you have a more recent build than the release build.
Yeah, that's correct. So they're not going to be in the release version. But if you send us an email, David, we'll put up our contact information at the end. You send us an email, we can get you a link to that.
Yeah. So it's an interim build. Certainly in version 22, which is due out next month, those additional functions will be in there. Okay, Jeff, we have little time left. We're probably going to go a little long, with apologies. Hopefully this is interesting and useful for you. And obviously you can leave whenever you want. You're not obliged to stay, but we've got a couple more workflows you want to follow. This one I think you'll find interesting. And as I mentioned at the start, this is one that we get a lot of questions on. The idea of embedding a link into a file. We've come home here. We're in the state of Maine, where our company is located. I have on the map here just a couple of 3 points. No attributes of any significance. In fact, no attributes at all. What I want to do is I want to create links to a file from, I'm just going to choose one. Obviously, we'll do multiple links to multiple locations, but this simulates maybe this project that my company is working on. One thing to note here, just another little bonus tip and trick, you'll notice that the main towns, which is this base layer, is red. The reason that is red is because I have disabled the selectability of that layer. Is that a word, Jeff? Selectability. It is, I think.
Yeah, we'll allow it.
I can't interact with it with the digitizer. I can't choose it with the info tool. It's just there literally for visual reference. It's almost like it's a raster layer now. The way I did that, quick right click, allow feature selection, and this can be applied to any vector layer, is checked by default. I just simply unchecked it. And by unchecking it, it colors it red to denote that it's not selectable and means I don't interact with it. In other words, I can select my points very easily without worrying about selecting something underneath. So that's a kind of peripheral tip and trick. Let's take a look at hyperlinking. I'm going to add an attribute, and just choose site 1 as my example here. I'm going to add an attribute that will essentially trigger the display of a file. It's basically an edit. You can do this when you drop a point on the map. Those of you familiar with Global Mapper will be familiar with this dialog box where you assign your feature to a layer, you give it a feature type, and you manage the attributes. You can add them manually. You can just, whatever the appropriate attribution is. What I'm going to point to specifically is this option, adding a file link. And it can be any file. There's no restriction. I could add an image, I could add a document, I could add a PDF, something that kind of expands on the information that you maybe have in your attribute table. Photographs are a common one, linking to an image so that you actually can see visually what's at this location. Just for a little creativity, what I am going to link to this location is a Global Mapper workspace. And if you're not familiar with what a Global Mapper workspace is, we're going to encourage you to do maybe our introductory session, which is the very first one we did. But workspaces are obviously proprietary files that allow you to kind of save the display of your map view. I have a number of these, obviously one for each site. I'm only going to use one in this example that I'm going to link to this location. We'll click open. Nothing visually has changed on the map. I now have a file link attribute. I'll just click OK. That edit has been applied. If I use my info tool now and I select the point that has now the embedded file, it gives me this prompt. I can either display the information such as I saw before, which would just give me that a display, a tabular view of the attributes, or I can choose to open the file. I can open it in Global Mapper if it's an appropriate format, or I can open it in Windows. In this case, I'm actually going to choose to open it in Windows. The reason for that is because it will allow Windows to open a new instance of Global Mapper. That embedded file is obviously a proprietary file. It will only open in Global Mapper. So with fingers crossed, I'll click OK, and hopefully in a second, we will get a fresh new instance of Global Mapper, and the data that was linked in that workspace is now displayed. So I was able to create an index map denoting where I'm working with embedded links to actually load the relevant data. Just some point cloud data and some image over here, just as a quick example. But you can set this up now as a very creative way to manage your data in a visual context by embedding these hyperlinks to whatever the file, appropriate file is, but in my case, obviously to a Global Mapper workspace. Now, that's step 1 of 2. My second step is something that you will not see documented anywhere. This is our secret, by the way. Nobody else knows about this. You are the chosen few. The default day, I'm going to save the workspace first. I'm going to unload my map from this map view. In Global Mapper's introductory screen, you'll see this load default data option. And if you click on it, it pops up a map of the world. Very simple. Something we introduced maybe 4 or 5 years ago, just to give you something to play with. As a new user, you can interact with this data. Not sure how much value it is from a practical perspective, but basically it shows you a map view. That map view, if I drag from off screen, is triggered by the contents of a folder. Under your program files, go carefully in here, by the way, and obviously you'd need admin rights to do what I'm about to do. I've got multiple versions of Global Mapper, including version 21.1. In that folder, you'll see sample data. And here is the file that was loaded. This is what happened. I'm just going to quickly drag this off my screen for the time being. Oops. See if it'll actually move. It's taking its time. Eventually it will. I think it's because I'm an admin, it's asking for permission. That's fine. I will continue that. And I should be gone. You know what? I'm going to oh, it's gone. It took a while. So that sample data is now empty. What I'm going to replace it with is the workspace that we just created. Once again, it's going to ask me to confirm am I an admin? I'll say yes, that's fine. Basically, you can put whatever file you want in here, or files for that matter. Now, again, this is not documented anywhere. This is literally a little underhand tip and trick here on kind of the kind of hidden tools that are available to you. Now, with this file loaded, I'll close the dialog box back in my main map view. If I click this button now, it will load that index map. So here is, based on a couple of workflows, a way that you can set up your workflow in Global Mapper to display your initial reference map denoting where your projects are, and then access the relevant data, having previously embedded the necessary information in that workspace. So again, you are the chosen few who are aware of that tool. Jeff, don't tell anybody, please. Don't spread the word. We have one more. I know we should wrap up here. It's after the top of the hour, but the last one that Jeff is going to show us is actually very, very cool. And Jeff, I'm going to hand the screen back to you again. Jeff is going to create a PDF for us.
Do so quickly. So what you're seeing now, so I have a point cloud loaded in Global Mapper. You can see on the right side, I have my 3D view docked. So standard point cloud. This one happens to have been created from our Pixels to Points tool. But, you know, again, we can view it by elevation, all that stuff. It's a traditional point cloud. Now, while many of us may work in Global Mapper and be able to use Global Mapper's 3D view to look at data, that's not always the case with some of our clients, or if we just need to quickly share a file. We have an option when exporting out of Global Mapper to export to 3D format. In this case, I will choose a 3D PDF, although we support a variety of 3D models. We're taking a look at the 3D PDF here. You can define some basic settings for that PDF, setting up the page, margins, and things of that nature. Once that's completed, and we won't wait for that process, I'll just bring this file over from off screen. What we have then is now a PDF of our point cloud that is fully three-dimensional. So I can pan and zoom around in it. I have some adjustments I can make to views and other things related to my 3D models. And if you're using an Adobe PDF reader, I don't think you need the Pro version. You'll have some analysis tools anytime you're working with some spatial data. So you may want to look at object info or maybe make some measurements. A quick way to do that right in the PDF, making it shareable and easy for some of your other users who aren't in Global Mapper to at least take a look at the data.
Very cool. I always love to end on some eye candy. That's really cool stuff. And completely interoperable. Obviously, PDF can be opened virtually on any platform. You know, it doesn't matter what platform you are, you can load a PDF. So if you're looking for a format to share those 3D visualizations with a client, with a customer, with your colleagues, the 3D PDF is definitely the way to go. And I gave you a little screenshot here on our last slide, Jeff, just to confirm what you just done. We overshot the top of the hour by a few minutes. Hopefully, this didn't inconvenience you too much. And hopefully you learned something. That was my objective at the start of the session, as I mentioned. Even those of you who are experienced hopefully picked up a few little tips. Certainly that changing the default data. I know you're going to go to town with that one now. If you have additional questions, if you're watching the recording of this, and by the way, if you have asked about the recording, give us a couple of days and we'll have the recording on our YouTube channel. You will get the email with that direct link. But if you're watching the recording, you have additional questions, or if we weren't able to answer your questions, we apologize. We'll follow up with those. geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com is your email. If you have questions on licensing, on maybe deploying this, maybe on a trial basis for your company, send an email to orders@bluemarblegeo.com. And if you do want to download a trial today, there is a free trial. You can basically go through everything Jeff and I have done, plus everything else in the software. bluemarblegeo.com/trial is the URL. Jeff, thank you so much for helping today and with your expertise.
You're welcome. Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we will see you all in a couple of weeks when we talk about scripting. Bye, everyone.